Dr. Jacques Mostert, the manager of Abbotts College. Tonight I want to talk to you about developing resilience, moving from the idea that I cannot do something to I can do something. Now, one of the phenomena that we know a lot about, specifically during this time of disruption, is that young people tend to be giving up much sooner than we anticipate them to give up. And to understand this phenomenon, we need to understand a little bit about what resilience is, and to be able to understand what resilience is, we need to understand a bit more about the whole construct of learning. Now, we know that learning will take place, whether we want it to or not. We just need to know what is being learned. And at this point in time, quite often young people are learning that I can't. I'm not able to do this. This is too difficult for me. And usually we are able to help young people to understand that there are certain things that you can do, and there are certain areas that you might not do very well in. You might fail in certain areas, but in other things and other areas you might be doing quite well. Unfortunately, when you have an imbalance of failure, then we get to do with something called learned helplessness. The next reason why young people decide that they can't do it is anxiety. And we're going to be looking a little bit more at the anatomy of anxiety and where it comes from and why it has become such a large part of the experience of young people in school. And then, inevitably, when we talk about adolescents and we talk about learning and their learning experiences and their learning journeys, we need to include the brain development of the young person to be able to understand why it is that young men sometimes overreact, or why a young woman will withdraw completely or do absolutely nothing. So learned helplessness is the concept that there is an imbalance between doing well and failing. When, for instance, you only do well and you are not challenged with anything, nothing is difficult, everything is always easy, we see that a sense of, but I don't have to study, everything comes easy to me. And that doesn't build resilience. That builds a bit of something that is called a confirmation bias. In other words, I don't have to study because I am already good at maths, or I am doing well at English or physics or life science. The other part is where learned helplessness comes in, and that is when there's only a sense of failing, and there's the idea and the belief that starts developing that no matter what I do, I cannot pass. No matter how hard I work, no matter how much effort I put into this, I am not able to do well. So that sense of constant failure then teaches the young person that they are not able to, and they then stop believing that they can't. The second thing that is really important to look at is our sense of expectation. Now, I really like the idea of having high expectations of everybody. Because when we have high expectations of ourselves, and when we have high expectations from our young people, and we support them accordingly, to give that balance between, yes, you can do this, and this is the area where you actually have to develop a little bit more, then having those high expectations will bear fruit. But having unrealistic expectations quite often provides pressure that is unnecessary. And this often speaks to parents who historically might want their child to do a certain set of subjects, and it either doesn't fall into the child's interest, it doesn't fall within their aptitude, or it is just not the right fit. And that then again kind of contributes to the sense of learned helplessness. I'm not interested in this subject, I don't really want to do it, but I have to do it because my mom and dad decided that I have to do that. And then, of course, the whole concept of unpredictability. Life needs to have a certain rhythm, a certain sense of knowing what is going to happen. So motivation and to be motivated to do something is very much dependent on the idea of being able to predict. So if we want to reward somebody so that they change their behavior, we know that that reward must be predictable, it must be measurable, and it must be certain that if I behave in a specific way, that reward will come. Now I want to quickly stop everybody right there, because when we start thinking about rewards, we're thinking about sweets, toys, money. That's not the reward I'm talking about. I'm talking about the type of reward that provides recognition for achievement. Not recognition for just having done my homework, no, but having done homework well that used to be very difficult, or having a specific area in a subject that I myself have decided that I want to go and revise or go and talk to the teacher. Now, what makes non-traditional education, specifically at Abbotts, very interesting is this idea of taking control over your own learning. We call it the homework period, but we need to nuance that idea of homework a little bit more. Because what it does is it contributes to the young person's ability to think about their learning, reflect about it, and then develop that metacognition, that ability to stand back from myself, stand back from my own emotions, and then actually engage in what I know, see what I don't know, and then solve that problem. And usually that problem solving takes place by going to the teacher or the subject specialist. In the beginning, we find that our mentoring systems actually helps a lot with designing and making them understand that they actually have this capacity, this human agency to take control over their own learning. The second problem that our young people are facing above learned helplessness at this point in time is anxiety. And when we look at anxiety, quite often people say to me, it's as if there's an anxiety pandemic. What can we do about it? Actually, anxiety is a very normal phenomena, if I might call it that, and it lies in the middle part of our brains. So some time ago somebody coined the term the lizard brain. It's actually the limbic system, and in the limbic system there is a small part of the brain that is called the amygdala that is in charge of reacting, withdrawing, or doing absolutely nothing. It is the 3 F's: fight, fright, or flight. So reacting or overreacting, going into the I'm doing absolutely nothing about it mode, or the freezing mode. Some parents out there will actually recognize this. Now, what happens is when you go into any one of those 3 modes, the brain releases a hormone called cortisol. And cortisol goes down to the kidneys, where it then triggers the release of adrenaline. And we know what adrenaline does. It goes into your stomach and you get that sense of butterflies, but sometimes it also feels like nausea that you are experiencing. The second thing it does, it makes the breathing deeper and faster, and then inevitably your heart starts beating much faster. Now, there's a very natural reason why this takes place, because the 100,000 years ago we had to run away from lions, and if you didn't have that boost of adrenaline, your body wouldn't be able to react and quickly start running away or go into a self-protective mode. The problem is, writing an exam is not running away from a lion. It doesn't need self-protection. And what happens is that because we are then in this constant mode of anxiety, do I know my work well enough? Will there be power or load shedding? What if we go into a next level of lockdown? How are we going to deal with all of these things? All of these uncertainties means that the cortisol loop just stays there all the time. It remains there and it doesn't get cut off. What is important about the cortisol loop is that it is only to have a quick burst so that the body can react. But now, when a young person is in an assessment situation, in an exam, every time they see a new question, what actually happens is the amygdala triggers a cortisol release again, and eventually you end up being in this state of anxiety for about 3 hours during the exams. What is very important is the fact that we need to be able to name our emotions. Once we have given something a name, it means we are familiar with it. And what we find with young people that are suffering from debilitating anxiety is that they have the physical feeling, they know that there is something that is completely uncomfortable going on in their emotions, but they don't know how to react. They don't know what to name it. They cannot express those emotions. And this is where non-traditional education plays a very important role at Abbotts, because through the mentoring system, you now have a significant adult that not only balances out the failure and success ratio that there is, but also helps the young person to start naming their emotions and not just disengage or become kind of dead inside. We must remember that the past year, the disruption that we have had the past year, all of the news that we've had, everything is just bad news over bad news over bad news. That sense of not being able to, as I've said before, predict what is going to happen, that has a negative influence, and then it causes sleep disruption. Now, the first way of dealing with anxiety is actually a very comfortable, easy way of dealing with disruption that doesn't need the help of a psychologist, a psychiatrist, or a medical doctor, and it is called breathing. So when young people go into a sense of anxiety, or they feel those palpitations in the heart, or they feel the nausea in the stomach, that absolute discomfort that the release of the hormones are causing, what they need to do is breathe. So this is a very simple breathing activity that actually should form part of the training for every young person, whether they are prone to anxiety or not. Very easy. Breathe in for 5 seconds. Hold the breath there for 5 seconds, breathe out over 5 seconds, and hold there for 5 seconds. And you do that 8 to 10 times. And what happens is the cortisol loop is cut in half, it is stopped immediately. And this can happen before an exam or any situation where anxiety kind of causes the discomfort that it does. The second very easy way to deal with anxiety is to get good sleep. Good sleep hygiene is probably one of the most important ways of helping young people cope with the stresses of life. Now, what we notice about adolescents specifically is that they either have hypersomnia, in other words, they sleep for 12, 13, 14 hours, they wake up very groggy, they're in a bad mood, and then when there's a lot of stresses, like we know, economic stresses that go along with disruption like we have right now, then there are emotional clashes within the family or even at school. Hyposomnia is when the young person has disrupted sleep or no sleep whatsoever. So the whole idea of, as they say, pulling an all-nighter when you study for an exam is probably the worst thing you could do. And the reasons for that are large and quite complicated, and we're definitely going to be talking about sleep in future webinars and discussions that we are going to be doing. An adolescent needs 9 hours of sleep. Now, what can parents do to make sure that their young person has good, solid sleep hygiene? First of all, the screen on your child's device is made specifically to have them be alert. It is blue light that is emitted, and that blue light is designed specifically to keep them awake. So if after homework or they go to bed at 9 o'clock, they go onto their phones or whatever device they have, and the blue light then kind of reminds the brain that it has got to be alert now, what happens? They stay alert, they actually become more awake as time goes by, and that then means that they don't have good sleep hygiene. So very easy. No technology after a certain hour. Yeah, but I can't really get my kids' phone away from them because this is their way of socializing, and especially in a time where there is social isolation. Actually, you know what? Sleep is much more important than the socialization that's going to take place between 10 o'clock and 12 o'clock at night. And so that is the first thing that you can do. The second thing that you can do is make sure that the access to the Wi-Fi is in your room so that you can switch it off and you have control over that access to the internet and access to their communications. The brain development of an adolescent is actually quite fascinating and is something that I can talk about for hours. I won't right now because I know that we have lots of questions that parents already have been sending in, and we can see the questions coming through. So what happens with any brain from birth onwards is that it develops from the bottom upwards and from the back towards the front. What is very interesting is that because the limbic system is towards the middle of the brain, we see that young people quite often have a reaction or overreaction, like I said, or they have that sense of withdrawing, in other words, going into the room and closing the door and you don't really see them, or that absolute inaction. They do absolutely nothing. The reason why they are kind of overreacting in these ways and these natural reactions are not mediated is because the orbitofrontal cortex, in other words the front part of the brain, where we learn how to make rational decisions, where we can reflect on the decisions we have made and we can redirect our behavior, only starts developing at about the age of 16, 17. Now, as everybody knows that young women develop a little bit faster than young men, and what we see is that by the age of 17, 18, young women can actually start looking at their own learning processes, their own emotions, and start mediating that by reflecting and redirecting their behavior. Unfortunately, this is not the same for young men, because their growth in the orbitofrontal cortex only starts taking place at about 17, 18 and moves on to about the age of 20. So the optimal time for a boy to be writing one of the most important exams in their lives would probably be 19 and 20, whereas 18 is fine for a young woman. So for parents who say, but I don't know how to motivate my son, it is actually quite difficult to motivate a young man at that age because, first of all, they like taking risks, and risk-taking behavior increases during late adolescence going into early adulthood. And that risk-taking sometimes means that not studying for an exam, because it is a risk. It's pushing a boundary, isn't it? And pushing a parental boundary. And quite often I have parents come to me and say, but my son just refuses to study. And that is part of that risk-taking behavior that is very normal at this point in time. So, is there a specific causation or is there correlation between what we are going through right now globally and a sense of anxiety, a sense of learned helplessness, and a sense of complete inaction? And I think there is. The lack of predictability and stability in young people's lives, things that we have no control over whatsoever, such as electricity supply, such as data being there or available, such as a lockdown that is sometimes announced at the drop of a hat, within 24 hours, removing them out of their social situation, their peer situation, that is very, very important at that age. That lack of predictability does contribute to a lack of resilience. The social isolation that is taking place is also very important. Now, we know that young people are digital natives. In other words, they know how to navigate their social arena. The problem with that is that the social arena within which they are functioning is also an unprotected arena. It is a place where half-truths and falsehoods and conspiracy theories and a variety of uncurated information is out there. And if they do not have that critical thinking skill or the global competency to evaluate what information they are taking in, it is quite difficult to be able to convince them, because it's quite easy for them to say, well, actually, I've seen it, and then whatever platform they see it on. The second problem is that we know that a lot of damage and specific anxiety and actually mood disorders among young people take place on these social media platforms. And because their device, their phone or whatever tablet device they have, is not removed from them, this type of criticism that we would be able to mediate because we go home, and at home we're in a safe space if all things are well, this is no longer there. This barrier between the social realm and the protection of the home no longer exists, because that type of abuse and bullying behavior and information and half-truths are actually now in where it is supposed to be a safe space. And it is vitally important that parents start taking on that role of the curators of the information that their children are actually consuming, rather than just being witnessing it or bystanders to the information they are seeing. And then alert fatigue. We are so tired of hearing about death. And we are so tired of hearing about infection rates and how vaccines are causing problems, or whether you should be taking a vaccine or not, and some of the non and half-truths that are out there, that actually one of the tools that parents and teachers use sometimes is saying, your prelims are coming up. Your exam is in a month's time. You really need to start studying for that now. That sense of alert is now completely gone, because we are so tired of being alert, and we are so tired of watching out because of all the masks that we have to wear. And this is a very interesting concept, because remember now that we have now gone through a disruption that was a biological disruption. But the technological disruption that is not only afoot, but is the current reality of our lives, grows exponentially. And that means that there's no longer going to be the mediation of change and change planning and change implementation that usually takes place. It is going to be complete disruption. As a matter of fact, one of the key aspects that people are looking for right now is the disruption of the market, the disruption of skills, the disruption of the status quo. The problem with that type of disruption and the frequency of that type of disruption is that this is now going to become our children's, our young people's lives. And if we do not take the time to step back, teach them how to critically engage with that disruption and actually start self-managing the barriers between the outside world and the inside world, that disruption is going to continue to develop learned helplessness and anxiety. And then, of course, we need to understand that there is a real-world financial impact on everything that we have been going through. Young people have been ripped out of places where they feel safe, where their friends are, where they have support, and they have been transplanted into other areas where it no longer feels safe. It feels uncomfortable. And it takes quite a long time for a young person then to kind of live through this grief process, because it is a form of grieving, because you have lost your friends and you have lost your social circle. Now, there is a strong sense of the failure of future-mindedness. We kind of feel that we don't want to think about the future, because if I think about the future, I actually have to deal with right here and right now, and that can sometimes be very scary. As parents, this is probably your biggest concern, is what is my child going to do in future? What tertiary education is going to be available for them? What job opportunities are going to be available for them? Will there be jobs that my child can be going to? And what is very important in this is that parents start developing a sense of future-mindedness, growth mindset, and the idea of, yes, none of this is permanent, and we can, through being grateful for what we still have, we can and we will cope. So what does this happen? Or what does this contribute to? What happens is that young people either pivot to one side of the spectrum or the other. The one is obsessive control. In other words, they start controlling what they take in, they start controlling the ways of eating, they start controlling people and situations around them, and that type of obsessive control then can lead to further mental health problems later on. The other is complete and utter disinterest. A sense of I am not interested in anything, and then we find situations where young people go into binging, either binge eating or binge watching or binge gaming, or spending hours and hours and hours on social media and not finding that balance. And this then is where we talk about a lack of resilience, that ability to fall down and stand back up again, sometimes physically and sometimes metaphorically. And if we, again, do not develop ways to mediate this, this can lead to actual mood disorders and larger problems. So when we look at everything that we've spoken about now, it is very understandable that young people kind of fall into that trap, into that rabbit hole of, I can't do this. But I want to talk to you tonight about the fact that we must be moving towards I can, and that it is actually something that is very possible. Now, when we start looking at our young people and some of the failures they have experienced, it is a knee-jerk reaction to say, you are the type of student with the ability to achieve at least a 60% or 70% for a subject, and you have failed that. I want to see a 70%. But that jump is so big that again we go to learned helplessness. So the first piece of advice that I want to give parents, young people and teachers is that we need to look at incremental changes taking place. When we start setting our goals or targets, we need to be scaffolding the learning in such a way that it doesn't feel overwhelming. Now, when I talk about scaffolding, it is not just a term that is used in the classroom. It is something that you should be doing at home as well. For instance, very easy to say, you have now been doing your homework for 2 hours, that's fine, you can do it. But that is not scaffolding the learning. What should happen is we should actually be looking at the time frames that we have and say, you learn more by studying and working and applying your knowledge for a half an hour and taking a 10-minute break than you do for applying your learning and your knowledge and studying it for an hour. The other very important thing that we know about the scaffolding is that you actually learn more if you study something 3 weeks ago, write a self-test, go to a past paper, fail it, and then re-study it 2 or 3 weeks later than you would by studying over an entire weekend, even if your sleep hygiene is good. You won't be able to form those memories. And most of what you have learned then just goes into the short-term memory. Now, the idea of walking into the kitchen and not remembering why you are there, it's not just for us parents. Our young people do the same thing. We know that they open the fridge door, they stare into the fridge for 10 minutes, and then when you ask them what they're doing, they actually will say to you, I don't know. Close the fridge door and walk on. And it is the same thing, because short-term memory is a little bit like the memory in your computer. It runs out, and if you don't switch it off, then you will find that your short-term memory actually doesn't help you much. The second thing is positive habits. Now, positive habits includes what we spoke about, sleep hygiene, but it also means that we start looking at things to celebrate. Having a bit more activity, spending more time talking about things that are not necessarily school related, but trying to find out what our young people are interested in and what their lives are like. So I've spoken about sleep, and this is very, very important. There needs to be a balance between green time and screen time. Now, because we know a lot of teaching and learning is taking place on screens right now through the natural process of what we are going through and the disruption of education as it is, it sometimes means that actually we just need to switch off all our devices and just spend a little bit time outside, spend more time moving around, maybe going to a botanical garden, maybe going into a nature reserve, and just spending time away from screens so that we can start forming a balance and those barriers between what is in our lives and what we allow in our lives. Social media, it is vitally important that parents start having a strong awareness of what their child's social media presence is, what they are seeing and what they are placing out there. And mom and dad, if this means that you actually have to go onto YouTube and find out what TikTok is, or Snapchat, or any of the other platforms, then maybe you should spend a little bit time finding out how these things work and how these areas of social interaction actually do influence our young people. And then diet, of course. Now, when we look at diet, we know that a heavy diet of carbohydrates actually cause us to feel tired and lazy. And I understand that teenage boys go through at least 2 loaves of bread a day. I have seen that in action and I understand that. But it is vitally important that we look at the vitamin D levels that are in our young people's bodies. They don't get out there so much as they used to, and this means that there is a decrease in vitamin D and therefore also a decrease in energy. And when there is a decrease in energy, then a sense of lethargy sets in, and again that sense of I can't, I'm tired, I don't really want to do this now. So it is very important that we look at diet. When we set goals, we need to set SMARTer goals. Now, most people know this acronym because it stands for specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, time-bound, a sense of self-evaluation, and then reward. Now this speaks to itself. The only one that I want to explore a little bit more is the one at the bottom, and that is reward. We think that if we go to our children and we say, for every C grade or B grade or A grade you're going to get, I'm going to give you an X amount of money, is going to be motivation for them. And ironically, this is the antithesis of motivation. Motivation needs to be more a recognition of achievement, a pat on the back, the expression of how proud you are of them, that they have taken something that at the beginning of the year seemed insurmountable, and they did it well. There are many experiments that I can talk about now that actually proves that motivation, if it is not certain, if it is not predictable, and if it is not valuable to the individual, that there won't be motivation. And what is one of the most valuable aspects of our lives? That is recognition, and we know this about adolescents. What is important is that this recognition can be parental recognition or another significant adult in the young person's life. And again, in non-traditional education, such as at Abbotts, we know that the mentoring system, the 7 reports that are incrementally staggered throughout the year, allows parents and allows the mentor to give that type of achievement recognition without breaking the bank and without wanting to buy them a car or give them 1,000 rand for every B grade that they've got. Communication is always vital, and as we know, the communication within the house and home is very, very important. And I want to talk specifically about either dinner or breakfast conversations. Dinner conversations are very important, and usually what parents do is, how was your day? And the answer is fine. What did you do at school? Nothing. Now we know they didn't do nothing at school because they went to school. They must have done something there. And yet these are the type of answers that we get out of our young people, and that's very natural to get those type of answers. As adults, we suffer from a collective amnesia that we were adolescents ourselves, and those were the answers we gave our parents. So you need to be more specific. You actually have to be a little bit smart, again looking at the acronym in the questions that you ask. What did you learn today that was surprising? What was the most interesting aspect of your day today? What happened today that you felt particularly proud of yourself? What happened today that made you feel sad? And those are the type of smarter dinner time conversations that we need to have. Communication with the school is absolutely vital. And again, I want to mention the 7 reports that in non-traditional education through Abbotts comes through, because this means that there is more regular communication with the parent, meaning that more nuanced conversations about the child's progress and what is needed can be had between the parent, the child, and the school. But what is very important is that you should not be waiting for the school to contact you. You should be the person that initiates the contact with the school. Make contact with a mentor, make contact with a student progress leader. Make sure that you engage with the staff so that you can have a better idea of where the recognition of learning and where the difficult areas where it can take place. And then of course you need to be looking at what is going well. If we constantly just focus on the you should be doing this much better aspect of learning, we very quickly are going to go back into that rabbit hole of learned helplessness. And every time we go down the rabbit hole of learned helplessness, what do we see? We see that the young people get back to the position of I can't. Now, I can see from my producers that there are quite a few people that have already said they have some questions, and on the screen in front of me there are some questions, so I'm just going to start engaging with some of these questions and see if I can help some of the parents out there. So Ida asked, How do I support my teenage son to cope with the matric load and the expectation to succeed? A balance either between what goes well and failing. Interestingly enough, Ida, we actually learn much more from our failures than we do from the things that we have done well. And I know in your life you probably have one or two things that you think, yeah, that wasn't a good idea, and you still remember it. But there are so many fantastic things that you did in your life, but you can't really remember them. And that is just the way the human brain has developed to make sure that we as a species continue. So the first thing you need to do is to say, it is okay to fail. But fail in time. Failing 2 days before the prelim exam, not a good idea. Failing now, while we still have, and I think it's about 10 weeks, Ida, before the prelim start and the final, when we look at not the year calendar, but the engagement between the teacher and your son. So that is the first thing. The second thing that is really important is build in areas for celebration. Make sure that you find things to celebrate. Make sure that you place emphasis on those things that are going well. And in the process of doing that, you then start helping your son to understand that actually I can. And gratitude. Let's be grateful for the things that we have. Let's be grateful that you do have a son that you can lead through this process in matric and this very important exam in his life. Second question is from Patricia. How do I teach my child to build resilience against those peers who insult and criticize and verbally bully her? First thing, remove social media out of the bedroom. That is the most important thing. You need to, Patricia, at this point in time, help your child decide what the barrier and the boundary is of allowing outside influences into her life. If her device, whether it's a mobile phone, whether it is a laptop, whether it is a tablet, is in her room and she has access to it, it means that barrier and boundary, that divorce that takes place, cannot actually be there. It means that the bully is now not only there during the school day, but that bully has now become part of the household because we are allowing them into our households. That is vitally important. Second thing, studying takes place in an open area, not behind closed doors in a bedroom, an open area where parents can walk past, motivate, monitor and curate what they are seeing. We need to develop a sense of agency with our young people. Your daughter needs to understand that actually she has the right to say, no, I am not allowing you into my bedroom. And that you only do through removing technology from there. And as I said earlier in my discussion, take the internet and put the Wi-Fi in your room where you have control over it and you can decide when to switch it on or off. Haley, thank you for your question. How do I balance out being a friend and being a parent to my 17-year-old daughter? Haley, I've got interesting news for you right now. Your friendship with your daughter is something that you have a long time to develop with. At this point in time, your daughter needs you to be a parent more than a friend. That sense of trust that you need to build with her and the relationship that you need to build with her so that she can come and talk to you about anything, that is not friendship. That is trust. In other words, if you have said you're going to do something, do it. Be available. Be there. Ask those smarter questions at the dinner and breakfast table. Okay. Yes, take her out for an ice cream. But that must not be confused for friendship. That is trust building. The friendship with your daughter is going to start when she's about 22 years old. And when you start seeing that she is out there as a young adult and making the mistakes as a young adult and learning from those mistakes as a young adult, at this point in time, you are still her shield and her mainstay. So build trust with her, and that's how you balance that out. Lauren asks, how do you motivate your young adult to passionately invest in their own future? Curiosity, I would say. Exposure to a variety of interesting things, making sure that they actually have the opportunity to go there and have a variety of experiences that are not necessarily 100% just online bound. The second thing is that curiosity will always win. Curiosity is the thing that Ken Robinson said, that you have to be in your element. You have to be in that space where you can go into flow and you don't even realize that time has passed. We sometimes think that we have to take control over the decisions of subjects for our young people, and we think that maybe it is the most important thing that they take a certain number of subjects that are at a certain difficulty level. But that is not what they are interested in. So I would say exposure to things that are out there, careers that are out there, discussions, take them out, let them see places, which at this time of disruption is obviously a little bit more difficult. But I think that is very important, to allow them to visit a variety of workplaces and ask questions. Then the last question is, how do I emotionally connect with my teen children and set healthy boundaries, particularly on social media? I think that I'm definitely going to be doing another one within this series about the emotional growth of young people and how we decide what is a healthy emotion. And we know that most young people at some point in time have a down or depressed mood. And when do we start worrying about that? And when do we not worry about that? Boundaries are set through trust. And as I've said earlier on, that the trust relationship means that you need to be consistent. You cannot be up and forgiving in the one day and then have stark rules the other days. Your word must be what happens. Your word must be your bond. You need to be able to be consistent in your choices and your emotions. And once you are consistent in the way that you approach their emotions, then you will find that trust builds. The next thing that is very important is discussing emotions. And as I said earlier on, teenagers, specifically between the ages of about 13 to 17, find it very difficult to name their emotions. And once we've given something a name, it is no longer foreign to us, isn't it? And then we can start exploring what impact it has. So have discussions about what different types of emotions are. And actually, it's a very quick Google search that you can do about naming emotions and just finding all of those emotions, such as joy and elation and disappointment and hope, fear and anxiety. I hope you've all had a very informative evening tonight, and I hope to see you soon at the next conversation we're going to have.